A very good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Great Hall at WITS University to tonight's or what promises to be an exciting and engaging topic on does the Christian God exist? I think that tonight we are going to be treated to a really good treatment of the topic, an energetic engagement between diverse views. On stage with me, I have an atheist, an agnostic, and a Christian. It sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. But I am thoroughly excited because I think that dialogue is something that we need to make a case for in contemporary South Africa. I think that not just to appreciate diversity, but where we see an engagement with diverse views and diversity itself. We have a tendency in many spaces to create these ideological camps with very little traffic going in between them. And so tonight we hope to see a real engagement, not a talking past each other, but really making sure that we are talking to each other, with one another, exploring this very important topic. I say also it's an important topic because I remember the first reply, actually, or one of the first replies when we put it up on social media, that we're going to have such and such a conversation. And somebody asked the question, is God still a thing? I found that to be quite interesting, and for three reasons. Because if you look at South Africa today, according to Stats SA, there are about 43 million people, at least in 2016, who identify themselves not only as believers in God, but specifically as Christians. Which means that no matter how you want to nuance that category called Christian, you can't deny the fact that for many people in South Africa today, the question of God or the concept of God still plays a meaningful role in their lives. It informs their decision-making matrix, it informs their behavior, it informs a lot of their conversations as well. So in that sense, if you think about it from a social imagery perspective, what really matters for the experience of many people, God is a very interesting and sufficient topic, relevant topic for us to be discussing, particularly as we phrased it tonight, the Christian God. But it is also interesting because it is, like I said, a case for dialogue, not just a case for tolerance, which is a very thin foundation, I believe, for such a complex, multicultural, pluralistic society as South Africa. We need something that actually forces people to really be able to leave the comfort zone of their views and engage with other people's views. I firmly believe that one of the things that's hurting us as a society is just the ignorance to one another's views. And lastly, I think it's also relevant because the people here that I'm about to introduce to you, who are going to be our speakers this evening, all have a firm view, or at least a view, and have something to say about the topic. Just want to make sure that, or at least firm enough. But I want to, and many of you guys will appreciate the role that many people, let me say, my speakers here this evening play in the life of South Africa, at least two of them, and informing opinions, shaping culture, leading culture, important thought leaders as well. And so what they have to say about this topic for me is really important. So without further ado, let me introduce you to my speakers this evening. My role is really minimal. It's just to play the role of a moderator and make a case for dialogue. But I will start with the one who is most likely to go to heaven this evening. Statistically speaking, that's the atheist, because according to the Christian scriptures, the first shall be last. And so, Jacques Rousseau is a lecturer in critical thinking and business ethics at the University of Cape Town and is the founder and the chairperson of the Free Society Institute, established in 2009 to promote secular humanism and scientific reasoning in South Africa. He and Dr. Caleb Lack are the co-authors of Critical Thinking, Science and Pseudoscience, Why We Can't Trust Our Brains. His essays on politics, science, religion, and rationality can be found on synapsis.co.za, and he's also active on Twitter as Jacques R. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome Jacques Rousseau. Eusebius McKaiser, who for most part, I think for many of you, needs no introduction, but I will do so anyway for formality. Eusebius is I feel like before I say this, I want to say he is here. They are here. Those who agreed to a dinner at a cafe called Salvation Cafe, yet refuse to believe in salvation, even those are here, and we don't know what to do with them. Please, we are waiting for a signal. Eusebius McKaiser is a South African political analyst, broadcaster, facilitator, author, public speaker based in Johannesburg. He has given talks and facilitated workshops that address critical themes such as unearned privilege, unconscious bias, inclusive corporate cultures, and how to reduce or eliminate familiar South African sources of conflict, namely racial prejudice, gender inequality, and various other forms of discrimination that play out in society. His political analysis, keynote speaking, and transformation workflow partly from McKaiser's work as an author and broadcaster. He has written 3 books, Abantu in My Bathroom, Could I Vote DA, which needs to be revised for 2019, Sfunugwazi, and Run, Racist, Run. His columns have appeared in the New York Times, Guardian, various BBC magazines, and all major South African papers. His writing engages social and political themes and identity politics. He is currently the presenter of the Eusebius McKaiser Show on Radio 702 and Cape Talk. Ladies and gentlemen, show some love for Eusebius. And lastly, the one who has the advantage of God this evening, Max Jeganathan, who was born in Sri Lanka and moved to Australia with his parents as a refugee when he was a baby. He graduated from the Australian National University with degrees in law and political science. After practicing law, Max worked as a political and policy advisor in the Australian Parliament for 7 years, most recently as a senior social policy advisor to the leader of the federal opposition. Max has recently completed a degree, in theology at the University of Oxford. His research interests relate to the relationship between faith, the role of government, and Christian moral frameworks. Max speaks globally at businesses, universities, conferences, and debates. Please welcome Max Jeganathan. And really, to start the conversation tonight, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to really give us a little bit of their biography, particularly in relation to the topic of God. So I'm going to give them about 5 minutes each, after which we'll go into a conversation an engagement between our speakers. Somewhere in the evening, we will stop, and what we'll do is I'll give you a few minutes to really write down your questions if you haven't done so already. We will collect those questions. Please, just for sorting purposes, if you can make sure that you write clearly and also write the name of the person that you're directing the question to, because we want to try and make sure that we balance the questions. That will be for the second segment, where we will go through Blitz, a segment with all your written questions. So without further ado, let me ask Max, let me start with you. Does the Christian God exist? Where do you stand with this?
I think I'm okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you So much for that warm welcome. I am an Australian, but I don't have any sandpaper in my pockets. I promise you that, which I think is important to get out of the way because we're here to talk about truth. For the more perceptive of you will already have guessed that I'm the Christian of the three panelists up here. I'm a follower of Jesus. I came to that belief and into that relationship with Jesus for a number of reasons quite a while ago now, when I was around 15 or 16 years old. And I hold that belief as a Christian that God does exist, that the Christian God does exist, for a number of reasons. And unfortunately, we're not going to have time to unpack all of them tonight. But I'd like to just give you a quick overview, just to help frame things from my perspective. So I divide the reasons for my belief, the reasons for my faith in the person of Jesus Christ and in his gospel message into two broad categories of reasons. The first category can be referred to generally as evidential reasons, and the second category, experiential reasons. And the evidential reasons, and again, I apologize for not being able to go in too much depth into any one of these reasons in a 5-minute block, but they start at their simplest and broadest level with some of the more classical arguments for God that many of you may have heard of before. Many of you may find points of agreement or disagreement with them. There's some of them that I found quite compelling in my search for truth when I was seeking. One was certain aspects of the cosmological argument, the moral argument for God, the argument from the fine-tuning of the universe, the teleological argument, which goes into the information and the complexities of the human cell and biological life. All of these things I found not just relatively compelling, but when you put them together, the cumulative impact of them I found quite compelling for the existence of a God, for a deity of some type. And of course, that doesn't get you to Christianity. It doesn't get you anywhere near Christianity. There's lots of religious worldviews that would agree or cede some of those arguments, if not all of them. So to that, as part of the evidential reasons, I would also add the reasons that point to and that go to the historical legitimacy of the Christian Bible as a document, as a historical document. Obviously, it's a complicated document, it's multifaceted, it was written over a number of years, but when I started examining whether or not this document is actually historically reliable, I started coming across all kinds of evidences and arguments that I found quite compelling. And so when you perform textual criticism on the Christian Bible, the number of original manuscript copies that we have, the amount of time between the events that those copies claim to describe happening as historical events and the manuscripts themselves when they're carbon dated back to when we have them, the earliest versions of them, I found that adding quite a lot of steam to this Christian belief ladder, if you like, that was being built. On top of that, I add finally, as my final kind of category of evidential reasons, the person of Jesus Christ himself, his life, his death, and his alleged resurrection, as we see in the eyewitness accounts of the 4 biographies of Jesus Christ in the Christian Bible. And when I looked at the evidence for the resurrection as a lawyer, using broadly the thresholds of proof and the admissibility rules of evidence in the law that I was taught, as someone, naturally quite skeptical and seeking evidence, I found that to be incredibly compelling, particularly the evidence that was extra-biblical, that actually came from outside of the Bible, because I understand the risks of being self-referential and circular if we're just using the Bible to reprove the Bible. So I totally was very skeptical of that, and I got that. But that kind of got me to the place in terms of the evidential reasons for my belief in Jesus. And that got me to a point where I was willing to step into that relationship. I accepted that he was whom he said he was. And then that brings me to the next part, which is the experiential reasons. Because since that day, it's not as if evidential reasons have just disappeared. In fact, I've had all kinds of questions and doubts since the day I became a Christian, and they've all been, routinely answered with further evidences and evidential reasons. But the experiential reasons that cumulatively compounded my evidential reasons were quite incredible. And while the evidential reasons went very much to my mind, the experiential reasons went to my heart. And these are, I think, the evidences of exactly what you would expect from a relationship if that relationship was real. When I started looking at my life and looking at the patterns in my life, I started interacting with God, and he started interacting with me, often and most often indirectly. through scriptures, through other people, but I felt his presence in my life. I had strong evidence, yes, subjective experiential evidence, but evidence nonetheless for me, and I saw all of that evidence in other people in my life too. So that experiential evidence took the reasons for my belief to another level. So for me, it was a combination of evidential reasons and experiential reasons. That's why I'm a Christian today.
Thank you very much. Jacques, your opening statement, please.
All right. Well, is this on? Yes. So, I was born at a very early age, to borrow a James Randi quip. But I think I was clearly born as an atheist, as we all are. So one kind of glib, which I won't stop there, one glib answer to the question would be that there could almost in a sense be no more that one needs to say, right? One almost has to explain how one lost one's way and went away from that natural state, would be one way of approaching it. That is not the way that I would want to approach this question at all, though, because I was on my road to theology, to divinity school at the age of 18, firmly intending to, on my way, that sounds like I was literally on the way. I did get onto a train to go speak to the guy who ran the school, to go and inquire about how long it would take and all that sort of thing. But I was committed to a path, because I grew up in an Anglican household. My mother took me to church and tried to encourage me to continue and so forth. So I was a firm believer and firmly on my way to that whole thing. And what changed, I think, was that I started becoming interested in philosophy, and I left South Africa in '89 for the US for 2 years. And while I was there, I read lots of philosophy, I read lots of religious studies and so forth, and it started striking me that there was just too much similarity and overlap between the sorts of questions, but more importantly, the sorts of answers I was seeing in all of these traditions. And that made it quite clear that we were dealing here with a human response to a human problem, to a human invention, and that these were various ways in which humans across different societies and different times have tried to grapple with the unknown. And also, perhaps partly thanks to the philosophical training, I realized that I was entirely comfortable with the unknown. There's this lovely Wittgenstein quote, which you might need to mull over in your heads a little bit, that a nothing will serve as well as a something about which nothing could be said. So if you have a mystery, it didn't seem very useful to me to plug in an even bigger mystery to solve it. It seemed to me that the natural world and that physics and cosmology and all of these sorts of things was pretty damn mysterious enough, and that we didn't need to plug in some sky daddy thing to play the role. So then I came back as this staunch atheist, and I was joking with Max earlier on, I became one of those people who I now actually quite dislike, who were abrasive and aggressive and obnoxious to religious believers and called them all sorts of names and so forth. Because over time I've realized that I have far more in common with some of my Christian friends than with many of my atheist friends, and one of those are in the audience tonight, one of my dear Christian friends, who value-wise is 99% kind of overlap. And I don't. The other thing is that the question of God really doesn't matter to me much at all. It's not an interesting hypothesis. It's not a hypothesis that makes much difference to my life, nor to anybody else's, as soon as they have food and housing and clothing and educations and a stable social system. This trend is incontrovertible, that if you look at nations which don't have material want, religion just drops and drops and drops. It fills a need. Anyway, my final comment will be to say, and Eusebius and I will need to argue about this later on, he and I will fight tonight, don't worry, is that I think that the billing here might be somewhat wrong, in the sense that I don't consider myself an atheist, and I think that he is an atheist too, which sounds, this is the philosophy part, right? Because I don't believe in anything with certainty, and that means I would refuse. So I'm an atheist just means I don't subscribe to theism, right? I reject the theistic view. But I wouldn't be one of those people who would claim anything like certainty that there was not a God. I loved what Max was saying there about first generalizing to any kind of theistic creature or person or whatever, or God, because that certainly is a different proposition to any particular one. I think I would be a strong atheist for a particular God far more easily than I could be an atheist for all of them. But if we talk about any factual proposition, I would say that I would have room for a doubt, right? So if you need an atheist to be somebody who is dogmatic and certain, then my name shouldn't have had atheist under it. I'd be one of those people called agnostic atheists. In other words, I'm pretty damn sure, but certainty is not available for anything in life, and this is no different.
Oh, thank you. I did tell you that tonight was going to be fun. Now, Eusebius, Jacques says you're an atheist. Someone on Twitter said you're fence-sitting. What actually do you believe as an agnostic? You believe that agnosticism, and I quote, is the paragon of intellectual virtue. And so, please tell us, what actually do you believe?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is an incredible turnout. God is good. Or is she really good? If she was good, she would have intervened to make sure you don't have an all-male panel. So, we're going to come back to the attributes of God in a second. The only way God can get off being criticized for not stopping the mantle on stage is perhaps if she doesn't exist. So for all your Christian affirmation of the slogan, God is good, it of course piggybacks onto assumption that God exists and that God in fact is good. And I want to use my 4 minutes to just sketch where I sit on the questions. Now, there are really two questions rolled into one because we wanted to make sure that we have maximum opportunity to debate a couple of issues with Max while he's in the country. One debate tonight is, does God exist? A separate question to debate is, does the Christian God exist? And I want to give you my clear view on that, and then we can, obviously, in the dialectic, unravel it a little bit. On the first question, whether God exists, I'm definitely agnostic. On the second question, does the Christian God exist? I am not agnostic. The Christian God does not exist. I'm very clear about that. And I want to tell you why on each of those two. As with Jacques on the first question, whether there's a deity, Christian one or not, I do not have any certainty on that question. I cannot rule out God's existence as a priori impossible. I just do not have sufficient evidence to believe that indeed God, whether it be the Christian God or any other God, exists. And I think that if you are responsible in the way in which you respond to evidence, which most of us aspire to, even if we don't do that routinely, but we have a norm in terms of forming beliefs as rationally as possible. And while we don't do that every second of every day, we still think it is a good norm to aspire to. There isn't sufficient evidence, despite what Max was saying, to support the proposition that a deity of any sort actually exists. And here I'm fully in agreement with Jacques, that you are simply plugging a mystery with a deeper mystery by positing that a God must exist simply because questions about, for example, the origins of the universe, what happened before the Big Bang, leave you so baffled that as a curious creature, you'd rather sign up for a theory that doesn't have evidence in support of it than to come to terms with what we do not yet know and what should be left to a scientific or research program in the academy or elsewhere. And it's strange because in other areas of our life, when a question is not live to us, we are patient. We don't think it's compulsory to take a definitive view. And this is where the idea of an agnostic as a fence-sitter is just such a caricature. Because while we are busy, for example, doing scientific research into the efficacy of the latest medicine to deal with, let's say, for example, living with HIV, you suspend your thoughts about whether that medicine will work unless and until we have clear enough evidence that you can swallow that tablet and it will make a difference to your health in a constructive way. And so why rush to take a view on a question where there isn't clear evidence? So what Max and atheists, the bad atheists, not nice ones like him, have in common is that they are both addicted to certainty and they are both too dishonest about what happens and what we should do when this happens, when we have insufficient evidence to believe a particular proposition. And what I say is the agnostic is not a fence-sitter. The agnostic is intellectually patient enough to say, do not commit to a belief in the absence of decisive evidence. So I'm not sitting here because I don't have the guts to let go of my Catholic upbringing. I'm sitting here because I think a rational being calibrates their beliefs to the available evidence. And there isn't available evidence that justifies Richard Dawkinson's position. There isn't available evidence that justifies Max's position. And therefore, there is something deeply, deeply rational rather than fence-sitting about being an agnostic. The second part of tonight's debate is easy, and I only need the 15 seconds, quite frankly. I mean, if God did exist, she wouldn't be the Christian God, because she would have to answer why it is that there's so much evil in the world that she's not eliminating, but she's apparently all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful. And I'm going to leave it here in a second. I can see that, that you're looking at me, Mr. Moderator. But you're going to have to give something up as Christians. Even if you want to believe that God exists, you're going to have to account for things like natural evil. And a little bit later in the evening, I'm looking forward, because I know some of you think that free will solve the problem, that God is so grateful, so gracious that she has given me free will. All the solutions for reconciling the Christian God with evil in the world does not work. And so if God does exist, God certainly can't be the Christian God.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, there you have it. Three positions laid out for us, but I think so the next session is just really to facilitate an interaction between the different positions here that have been laid, perhaps maybe to ask for a comment. Let's maybe put a spotlight on you, back on you, Max,
Sure.
and ask the both of you maybe just to interact with what he has said, and I'll ask for him to just give some responses in a while, maybe focused responses to your specific questions or comments. Jacques, I'll start with you.
So Max, I mean, as I was saying in my opening remarks, I do appreciate that the nuance you brought to that position about how you were first led by the evidence to believing in some God. I still don't don't find myself convinced by the second step, by your choosing the Christian God, and here's why. They're far older gods than that. They perhaps aren't as well documented, but there's a longer track record of them. They perhaps have a stronger thread throughout history. I mean, the Christian God is Josephus and Tacitus, I think. I think there are two ancient historians that mention the Christian God. So it almost seems as if it would be fair to accuse you of a kind of circularity there, in the sense that this is the dominant religion that you are exposed to, perhaps for most of us that we're exposed to. You come to believe that there's some kind of God, that some kind of God is plausible, and this is just, it seems like a natural fit, rather than something you get to via the evidence.
Sure, can I respond to that?
Please.
Yeah, look, thank you so much for your comments. And also, I didn't say at the beginning, I'm really grateful to these guys for their time tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here with thought leaders like this in South Africa. Your question is a reasonable one. I should start by saying, though, of course, that I was born in Sri Lanka, which is a Buddhist country nationally. I'm a Tamil, so I'm from the north of Sri Lanka, historically. My ancestors were all Hindus. And so the premise that people are just kind of grasp at what they're born into, I think runs the risk potentially of making a category error, because that may well be the case. But if it is the case, it's the case for atheism and agnosticism just as potentially as it is for Christians. And secondly, the main point of the category error is it doesn't detract from the fact that it might be true. If I'm born into something, whether I'm an atheist or an agnostic or a Christian or a Hindu or a Muslim, the fact that I was born into it, where I'm born, doesn't have any impact on what's true and what's not true. If the religion is false, the religion is false. If the belief is true, the belief is true. So I don't think where we're born or what we're surrounded by is of any relevance in terms of the truth value of these claims. The other point I would make is that you said, and I would take issue with this part of what you said in your opening statement, you said that in your investigation, you found not just the questions very similar, but the answers very similar as well, that the different religious views were having upon an initial inspection. My view is that I would submit to you, which when I was investigating most of the major worldviews, including atheism, is that at a superficial level, some of them, if not most of them, may seem similar, but at a deeper level, they're anything but similar. They're fundamentally different. to the point of being mutually exclusive. I think it was a theologian, I don't think it was a Christian, who said all the major religions, pretty much agree on everything, except for God, sin, creation, the afterlife, morality, ethics, epistemology, and so forth. So what led me, and I take your point in saying, well, why didn't you look at all of this other stuff? I did look at the other stuff. I did look at the other religions that have talked about God or gods through human history. But I honestly just didn't find compelling evidence to the extent that I found it for the Christian God. And it could well be because I thought I was debating an atheist and an agnostic. I think I'm debating an agnostic and an atheist. And I'm not sure who's in which chair. I don't think it's going to matter because they're both bigger than me and have more facial hair. So if they crash tackle me all night, I'll be on the back foot in any case. But for me, the unique distinction, just from a context of evidence, and I have 25 seconds, so I won't be able to go any more deeply into this, but the distinction for me is that the Christian God, if he's real, as I believe him to be, he doesn't sit far off in some mythological supernatural realm in perpetuity. He actually stepped into his creation as a person, if he is who he says he is, stepped into his creation as a person into human history, which is verifiable, testable, evidentially grounded, if it happened.
Thank you. Eusebius.
Max, I wanted to spend the bulk of the time talking specifically about the Christian God and getting to the question of evil, but to be fair to the moderator, I'm going to engage what you actually said for the moment. I didn't find the logic on the evidential stuff compelling at all, I'm afraid, Jacques. I think you're being very kind. And I want you to do a little bit of work here for me, and I'll tell you what my problem is.
Sure.
Sort of seem to be using the kitchen sink approach. So if you have 200 famous philosophical proofs of God's existence, and each one is weak or not clearly unanswerable, then you can stack them up, and then you can say things like, and here the wordplay came in that I caught on in the way you framed it. When you put it all together, that is really compelling. Well, you can put lots of bad arguments together. It doesn't increase the weight of those arguments.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So you were smoothing over the weaknesses inherent in each one of the arguments for God's existence that you were citing, and then saying to us, if you put them together, then clearly God jumps out at you. So let's pick one of them by way of example, and I'll do it very quickly.
Sure.
Inferences to God's existence from the complexity of design, for example, do not get you to a deity existing. As Jacques says, all it gets you is a mystery and then an invitation to be agnostic.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Eusebius. Thank you for addressing what I said instead of swinging generally at something else. I completely take your point, and I did brush over them very, very quickly. And I apologize for having had to do that because I only had 5 minutes. But I will say this point in the context of evidence and thresholds of belief and what constitutes sufficient evidence for belief. The cumulative case, which I did make in a very general sense, the cumulative case is exactly how not just legal systems, but all kinds of sciences, quantitative and qualitative, work and have worked for tens of thousands of years. And the point that I will make is that you're absolutely right, that some of the arguments for God, full stop, in my view, and I'm sure you'd agree with all of these, hold absolutely no water. And I specifically didn't cite those. There are other arguments out there like the ontological argument, which I may just not be bright enough to understand, but I don't think that holds any water for me. So there's a lot of arguments out there for God that I don't find compelling in the least. And there's some arguments out there like the cosmological argument, for instance, that I think has some weight, but it certainly doesn't get you to a deity. But when you have a premise that you're seeking to prove or disprove, we're all operating, and I know you guys have both used this framework for epistemology, we're operating on an inference to the best explanation possible. We're being inductive here because we've all agreed that you can't be deductive about these things. There's no deductive 150% way to get to an answer either way on this question. Otherwise, we wouldn't all need to be here tonight if we could be deductive. So we're all doing inference or induction to the best explanation. The question is, who's doing inference and induction to the truth? That's the question that we're here to gauge. And what we can do is look at all of the arguments and the evidence and see which one is more likely to be true. out of all of the explanation out there. So agnosticism, atheism, these are all propositional truth statements that you can test the truth value of. So is the Christian faith. What I'm saying is that all of these different truth statements, what matters is the warrant behind that. Alvin Plantinga, the philosopher, uses this idea of warrant. That's ultimately what determines truth value. The only good reason to believe in any of our positions is if they're true. The only good reason to believe in Christianity is if it's true. And so my response to you would be that on terms of the evidential threshold that I use, I began with a balance of probabilities threshold. And I subjected every worldview that I could think of or get my hands and heart and mind on to the balance of probabilities threshold. The Christian worldview did not only get me to the balance of probabilities threshold when I very focused, closely studied the evidence, but it got me all the way up beyond that to somewhere very close to beyond reasonable doubt. And as a lawyer, I know that's something that a lot of people would scoff at, a lot of people would nod at, a lot of people would laugh at, a lot of people would clap at, and ultimately that's a matter of how one responds to the same types of evidence. My question to you guys, as I'll make throughout the night, is to question the level of engagement that you have had with the evidence that I've seen. And I'm happy to share that with you and break that down.
And I'm going to give you an opportunity to do that. Thank you,
Sure.
Max, in a moment. I think just to shift the spotlight a little bit over to Jacques and ask Max, Eusebius, for your questions, comments on Jacques' position in particular. Yeah. I'll start with you,
After you,
Eusebius.
Eusebius,
Yeah.
Where do we disagree?
Yeah, I'd like to hear the answer to that question too.
Let me also say a little bit more. I'm being a little bit naughty. I've got a slight agenda here.
Yeah, I need some time.
So Jacques and I have interesting conversations about religion all the time. We're very, very good friends, and we're great interlocutors on some of these questions. And Jacques has a view that I want him to explain, where to some extent he thinks that him and I at times only have a verbal disagreement rather than a real disagreement. But he's got an interesting political view why the label atheism, if you must have one short label, is one that I should subscribe to myself. Maybe it's useful to share that, Jacques.
Yes, I mean, I suppose this is a legitimate disagreement that we have in terms of strategy. I mean, so I think you've gathered that in terms of the epistemology, we don't disagree. Or in terms of the ontology, especially here. So the existence of God. But the political point is that, as I was saying in my introductory remark, in a logical sense, I would say that agnosticism would be the position because there's no certainty about any proposition in the world. But I tried to persuade Eusebius back about 3 years ago that he should call himself an atheist in any public gathering, in any non-philosophical seminar room kind of gathering, where people don't necessarily understand the epistemology, right? So saying that you're doubtful about something will normally be read as a confession of weakness, that you're not sure, okay, therefore tomorrow I can turn you into a Christian, or whatever the case might be. Whereas if you say that to me in a philosophy seminar, I will know exactly what you mean, and I mean, to kind of borrow some of Max's language, we know that on the kind of balance of probabilities and whatever, you are firmly convinced that X is the case, that there is no God. But I hear that. The public might hear that you are persuadable, right? So as a political device, we should call ourselves atheists. But when we get a chance to talk to atheists, we should try to remind them that their dogmatism is sometimes as repulsive as religious dogmatism.
Eusebius, thank you. Jacques, you still have a minute and a half, and I wanted to find out if you had something more to say, maybe to clarify, or should I move on to Max on that? All right, Max.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. So Jacques, one thing I'm interested in just hearing you flesh out a little bit more, there seems to be, and you see this might be a preview, I may ask you a very similar thing in a moment, but there seems to be a bit of a sentiment on that side of the panel, a consensus, if you will, by the South African contingent on the panel. And this consensus seems to be of a very intellectually grounded, comfortable uncertainty about the existence of God, if not the Christian God, over there. Please rebut that if I've misunderstood that or misrepresented that. But my point, my submission to you is this, and then I'd love to hear your response, Jacques, is that when you hold a position that you're open but you're pretty confident that something doesn't exist, that is, and I don't want to use the word dogmatic, but I will, because dogmatism is actually a belief in truth and the nature of truth as being by its definition exclusive. So if truth by definition is exclusive, then we're all dogmatists of some type. You guys have just shared for 5 minutes each what you believe, and you believe that dogmatically. You believe it dogmatically. C.S. Lewis famously said there's only two types of people, conscious dogmatists and unconscious dogmatists. And often it's the unconscious dogmatists that are the most dogmatic.
Can I ask for a response? Thank you. You have time.
Yeah, so I'm not convinced by almost anything of what you said now.
I'll take your point.
Firstly, because there's something you did there which you also expressed in a previous contribution, which is to combine atheism with religion, with Christianity, as if they're on the same sort of playing field. They're not both worldviews. They're not both things in which, I mean, there's the burden of proof issue, as you as a lawyer would well know. I mean, so I'm just saying that this proposition is not persuasive to me. And you do that in your life all the time, for example, when it comes to all the other gods that you choose not to believe in, right? So if you're calling that dogmatism, then the definition of dogmatism is a very peculiar one that you're holding here. I mean, so I imagine that none of you in the audience and none of us on stage believe in unicorns, but we wouldn't call ourselves dogmatic about that, right? It's just something for which we have no evidence. And the difference between I would posit, between you and I, or between religious believers and I, and Eusebius too, is that our belief is still falsifiable. I could imagine divine skywriting that addresses me personally and says, "Hey, Jacques, you're wrong, and do you know that hell is not very pleasant? Come on over to my side." Or something like that. And I would be struck with enormous doubt. I would still not necessarily know. I mean, the message would have to include the Bible is right. So I'd know which God to pick, right? But I can imagine a scenario in which my mind would be changed, and I think it's far less likely or far less easy to imagine a scenario in which the religious believer's mind will be changed. And lastly, the other point of disagreement with what you said, which I think which includes now everything, is the complacency charge is, I think, uncharitable in the sense that, as my intro narrative said, I'm not an emotive kind of person, so I didn't describe it in terms of traumas of dark nights of the soul and so forth. But going from a lifetime of Anglicanism to becoming an atheist wasn't just okay, today I'm going to stop believing kind of thing. I did go through some thinking about this and some emotional journeys about this.
Sure.
Thank you. All right, let me move the spotlight onto Eusebius. Questions, comments? Max.
Thank you. I just want to say, just before I ask you, Eusebius, I wasn't for a second trying to trivialize your journey to your atheism or to what you currently believe in. So I apologize if it came across like that. I know you're a far more deep-thinking person than that, so that wasn't my intention. So Eusebius, and I think both of you have raised this in some parts, but I was interested in your thoughts on this, because we've talked a bit about burdens of proof, and the burden of proof being on the believer, if you like. Certainly a greater burden of proof being on the believer. But for one who holds to a view that believes in the proposition that there is no God, or that there is no Christian God, let's say, yes, that is, as you would know, that is seeking to affirm the non-existence of an entity. And seeking to affirm the non-existence of an entity, as you would well know, is a pretty big epistemological call, affirming the non-existence of a particular entity, the Christian God. If I was trying to prove the existence of oranges, then all I would really have to do is to show you evidence for the existence of oranges. But if you were trying to prove, or I was trying to prove the non-existence of oranges, I would have to effectively, implicitly at least, posit that I had full and complete knowledge of all fruit, and oranges were not one of them. So my honest question to you is this: don't you think, or on what basis do you think we can be so certain about the non-existence of God when we have incomplete information? All of us, the Christian God, when we all have incomplete information.
We don't, actually. Can you hear me?
Say that one.
No, we don't, actually. Your question is quite easy, I have to say, because the analogy is not compelling. I mean, I can't know a potential fruit that might yet be discovered in a far-flung corner of the world. That's very different to putting the Christian God up to an empirical test when the Christian God is alleged to have the following features: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. So, for example, if there's natural evil in the world and God is all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing, why does he or she, or if they're gender non-conforming, why do they not stop natural evil? Which means that one of the three characteristics attributed to a Christian God fall away. I mean, that's a logical problem. That is a burden that you have to discharge. Absolutely. So the analogy, the fruit analogy, is fruity. It just doesn't get you very far. And this is a deep philosophical problem for Christians, right? And I've yet to come across, as a philosophy student, a compelling resolution to the problem of evil. So on the one hand, you have natural evil to deal with, and then of course the other kind of evil is evil that emanates from the choices that I make as an individual. Now here, the best attempt at a defense is what I alluded to in the dying seconds of my opening statement, the idea that the Christian God is so loving that he has allowed me to have free will to make mistakes. Well, that argument only gets you so far. I've got a bottle of water here. I have holes here. If you say to me, Eusebius, you've got to choose one of those two. Now I'm thinking to myself, oh shucks, what the hell, I want both. I can only take one. Which one am I in the mood for? Okay, I don't need water yet. My mouth is not dry. The evening's going well, but I feel like sucking on a sweet. Great. Okay, so now I'm opening this thing. I'm chowing it. So, did I exercise free will as I chose between the two? Let's simplify it and say I did. I had two options. And flowing from my agency, my taste, my preferences, I reached out for one of these two objects in front of me. Eusebius, McKaiser exercised free will. The fact that there isn't a can of Coke in front of me, the fact that there isn't a kip in front of me, does that reduce the amount of free will that I have? Well, no, because my free will is exercised in relation to at least two choices in front of me. So here's the problem for the Christian God. When it comes to moral evil in the world, why do you not eliminate, for example, the choice of a pedophile raping a child? You're not going to not endow that pedophile with free will. You can simply make sure that the set of options over which the free will can be exercised exclude really horrific things like children being preyed on, for example. So whether we talk natural evil or moral evil, there's no way you can reconcile the three core attributes of the Christian God with the existence of evil. That's a logical problem that is disanalogous to fruit that has yet to be discovered.
Thank you. Jacques, your comments and questions for Eusebius.
So I'm quite interested, Eusebius, in your views, and I wholeheartedly agree with what you just said, but I don't believe in free will at all. But anyway. So the question I'd have for you, or the thing I'd like your thoughts on, is to what extent do you think this debate actually matters? And to just flesh that out a tiny bit, as I was saying in my introductory comments, I think that if we focus on things like education and allowing people to have socioeconomically healthy lives and so forth, I think the religion question will solve itself. And that if we criminalize we have criminalized some of the harmful things that people sometimes do in the name of religion, like bombing abortion clinics and whatever, that's already criminal. We can just focus on the acts, let people believe what they want to believe, and over time it will dissipate. We all have irrational beliefs of some sort. This one is treated as if it's somehow far more important. Is it in your mind or not?
Thanks for that question, Jacques. It's very important. I wish I had more time to think on it, but I suspect 3 minutes of a grammatical pause will not be the best use of my 3 minutes. I think it does matter because if, for example, the Christian God did exist, I suspect you and I would agree as agnostic atheists that we ought to rethink how we go about living. So as a moral philosophy student, the central question in moral philosophy, or central two questions are, what should I do as a moral being? And what kind of person should I try to become? Those are deeply moral questions. If the Christian God in fact exists, then clearly there's a sense in which my lifelong commitment as a philosophy student thus far to answer that question without any reference to the Christian God has been a methodological oversight that will cost me in terms of the most truthful answer to that question. So I think that's what's at stake. Slightly smaller than that, particularly with a university audience, there's simply our commitment to knowledge that is also at stake here, whether we talk the Christian God or any other deity. There's nothing in terms of, from a phenomenological perspective, at stake for me here tonight, which is partly why I'm also an agnostic. I don't have any urgency about the question being solved, but I'm still here rather than getting drunk in Melville somewhere, because I have a deep intellectual curiosity insofar as I think as beings who are curious about certain kinds of big questions in the world, this debate and this discussion tonight really does matter. And I think those people who on social media, for example, have trivialized what's at stake, asking questions like, is God still a thing? I'm afraid they are, I don't want to sound snobbish, either or both intellectually and morally, to some extent, not quite as well endowed as those of you are here.
Thank you. What I want to do, I think, just to revisit some of the issues that are still lingering before we move on into some of the Q&A. They might as well pick it up. I think the audience will pick up those and it'll reflect it in the questions. So I'll give you just a brief, maybe 2 minutes to just give some reflections, and then I'm going to take questions from the floor. Through written questions through your cards. So if you can just start getting ready. But it seems, Max, there is a lingering question about the question of evil or the problem of evil, both moral and natural evil as well. So let me give you 2 minutes to give your response to that. And I'm going to, I think, highlight similar issues with you, and then we'll move on.
I'll start by saying that, Eusebius, you are absolutely right to raise that issue. This debate or discussion would not be worth its salt if I wasn't made to respond to this issue. I agree that it's the most difficult issue for a Christian in terms of explaining or rationalizing somehow an all-loving, all-powerful God with the amount of suffering and evil that we see in the world. I understand that you don't find this a compelling or an acceptable response, but I think some of the moral suffering in the world that we perpetrate against each other is born out of the freedom that God gives us. And I say this because the Christian God, if he exists, and I believe him to exist, is a God of love. And love, as what most of us understand to be the supreme ethic of the human heart, for it to be authentically manifested and exercised in relationship, it needs to be chosen freely. There's no love between people who are compelled to love. And so unfortunately, the unfortunate, undesirable, but very real outworking of freedom to love exercised incorrectly is hatred, is moral hatred and moral evil. The question of natural evil, the question of things like natural disasters and kids getting cancer and genetic irregularities and those sorts of things, I completely concede that my answer just now didn't go anywhere near that. And as you said, Jacques, earlier, from quoting Wittgenstein, on this issue, I think Christians have to be comfortable with some uncertainty too. And Eusebius, you said it as well, that uncertainty is okay. And if God does exist, then he necessarily has more information than us. He has a greater perspective than us. He exists primarily in the metaphysical realm, not just the physical realm. And so if there is a bigger picture and a God, he sees that bigger picture in a way that we don't. So there would be things necessarily that we don't understand. This is one of those things that I think has to go into that category. But what it doesn't mean is that while the Christian gospel, and me sitting here now, doesn't have a knockdown 150% deductive answer for you, what it does have is a knockdown answer in terms of how it responds to suffering and responds to evil. It is a God who came into the world and suffered alongside us, suffered with us, suffers for us, and offers us hope through the suffering. Jesus Christ is the only God with scars. That says something.
Eusebius, there's a question, I think, tonight also just regarding the different types of things that we can know with varying degrees of certainty. So I think sitting here, you're saying, I've looked at the evidence for the existence of God, or as broadly maybe the atheist camp would be against the existence of God, or I find none of them compelling enough for me to make a positive affirmation or affirmative statement, a response to the proposition God exists, particularly the Christian God exists. What is there special criteria that you use for God? In this case, that you come out as an agnostic, or are there other areas in your life where you say, I do know and I do accept the evidence for their truthfulness? And if so, what are some of those things? Is there a distinction that you make? What can we know? What can't we know?
Great question, and it's obviously a deeply epistemological question. So yes, where I do actually agree with Max on some things. Most of the beliefs that we have, whether we talk little small beliefs about you will get killed if you were to cross the highway, if you drink poison, you might get killed, or that something might cure you, or whatever the case might be. A lot of these beliefs are not on the basis of certainty, but probabilistic reasoning. So I accept that agnostics and atheists routinely take decisions under conditions of imperfect knowledge and information. And you cannot but do that with most of the decisions that you take on a daily basis and in your life. So then a legitimate question that I've grappled with, which as a student was often the toughest thing to respond to atheist philosophy student dicks-mates to or Christian friends rather, to respond to is, well, if probabilistic reasoning is reasoning that you are open to in the rest of your life, why not come to God through probabilistic reasoning? Well, here I'm afraid, Max, if we were to say that most beliefs are not formed under conditions of certainty and perfect knowledge, and so come on, Mr. Agnostic, just decide where the evidence weighs more strongly on a probabilistic scale, then I'm afraid the atheist case is actually more compelling. Actually more compelling, because the positive evidence needed to even get the Christian thesis or the deity thesis off the ground as an intuition to account for why the universe came about at all has not been established, even though somehow, and I hope he was a better lawyer than a theologian, I say this with my tongue in cheek, even though Max insists that the beyond reasonable doubt standard of criminal law is met by the evidence for the Christian God's existence. So when it comes to probabilistic reasoning, and we accept that we don't need to wait for certainty, and we eliminate agnosticism from an epistemic point of view, then it's very clear to me that the case for atheism is obviously stronger than the case for theism.
I'll just riff on the same thing.
Thank you. Can I raise just an issue? I think just on Max thinks that the type of God described in Christianity is compatible with evil, moral and natural. But even if God doesn't exist, I think some of the things that Eusebius mentions about our world, just in terms of the wrongness that we see in our world, some of the suffering, some of the pain, and so forth. I guess as somebody who obviously doesn't share the same belief in the existence of God, how do you make sense? How do you account? How do you process, if you like, the wrongness that we see, that we make very strong moral pronouncements against in our world?
Sure. Before addressing the human thing in a world without God, I just want to emphasize something that Eusebius said there, because I think people forget that the thought experiment of imagining these questions in a framework that does not presume God is highly unnatural to all of you and to us. But spend some time really playing with that idea of coming up in a world where there isn't that pre-existing idea and being told that there is a God and the suffering is part of its plan and that you can't understand it. So if you hear a phrase like God is a God of love, what is the word love supposed to mean in that sentence? I mean, it really is quite a mind-melting thing if you set aside your existing beliefs about God and try to do that. On the human thing, we need to be taught to be altruistic. It's as simple as that. As we learn to live with each other, we discover more and more ways in which we are prone to selfish behavior and to tripping each other up and to getting in each other's way. It's not a naturally compelling position to believe that my own self-interest is best maximized by being altruistic. But as soon as you learn a bit of game theory, whether you learn it in an economics class or learn it just through being alive, you realize that your interactions with me and with your fellow other humans is not a one-shot iteration, because you carry a reputation with you. And if you are a cruel person, over time you will stop getting invited to dinner parties, or you'll be in jail and have a horrible dinner every night by yourself, right? So we take time to learn that lesson, and as societies become more evolved in terms of their educations and so forth, these lessons become natural, and kids grow up knowing them, and we slowly see less of these horrible things being done to each other. You'll always still have a percentage of outliers who are still selfish and don't care, or who are mentally damaged in some way and don't have the capacity for caring, but that is the solution to these problems.
Thank you. Can you join me in just showing your gratitude so far to our speakers? That's one of the things about listening to a great conversation. You forget about the time. We've just gone an hour in conversation about this topic, actually. And we've now arrived at that time where your questions matter and we need them to be part of this conversation. So please, won't you take a moment to write your questions down on those cards that you either were handed to or you found them on your chairs, and then please pass them along. What we will do is we will take 5 minutes, so at 25 past exactly, we will start fielding those questions. Please remember to write the person that you're addressing the question to. It'll just make it easier for us to sort. Okay, so in 5 minutes, we will start taking those written questions. Please pass them along to this end, or actually either end. There'll be somebody walking through your aisle and taking your questions. All right. So the way it's going to work is so there's a question. Can I have your attention, please? So the way it's going to work is, thank you so much. You followed the instructions. There's even a title here, To the Bad Atheist. Hashtag, actually. But you've addressed it fairly. I think we are able to. I think that's Max. Max, you're a bad atheist. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose your question. I'm restricting them in time, so that also, I guess, will impact how much they can say. The idea is we'd love to get them interacting with as much as, of your thoughts as possible during this time. Okay, so let me start with you, Max. If we are the children of God, as he or she is,
Someone needs God in their life.
I do. Why has he or she not shown up? Example, a mother or father who claim they have children but never bother to visit their children.
It sounds like it's from an atheist or an agnostic, but it also sounds like a question I could have planted in the audience. It's interesting, when Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space, and obviously from an atheistic regime, was an atheist himself, got up to space, he came back and he said to everyone, I've settled the question, I've been up to space, I've been up to the heavens, and you can all relax, God does not exist. I can confirm that he doesn't exist. And C.S. Lewis, who was a Christian public intellectual at the time, a professor at Oxford University, he said, for Yuri Gagarin to go into space and claim that God does not exist is similar to Hamlet going into his attic and claiming that William Shakespeare doesn't exist because he can't find him up there. And where the analogy breaks down, and of course C.S. Lewis was right, because they operated in different realms. William Shakespeare was in a different realm to where Hamlet was in. The analogy breaks down where we look at what would have happened. How could Hamlet have actually known who William Shakespeare actually was? The only way Hamlet could have known is if William Shakespeare wrote himself into the play. If he actually made himself a character in the play. That's exactly what the Christian God did.
Any response? To Eusebius, was Jesus Christ, a historical figure? If so, what do you say about his claims?
Well, again, I mean, in a longer conversation, we would obviously ask Max, sadly, to bear the burden for all Christians and to some extent other denominations and explain some of the things that are not compatible with modern science that Jesus is alleged to have been able to do, like magically turning Nestle pure water into wine, for example, and all sorts of other claims that are very hard to square with science. So no, the assertion of the existence of the historical Christ doesn't get you to the Christian God as is professed through the traits of being omniscient, all-powerful, and all-loving. It doesn't get you that far. At most, if a historic Jesus Christ existed, must have been someone just as ordinary as you and I.
Thank you. Response, Jacques?
So, a brief response to what Eusebius said there. Again, notice how we're slipping automatically in language which privileges one side of the argument. They're not Jesus' claims. They're claims made in a book called the Bible, which already assumes those claims to be true. We would need Jesus to make these claims in other independent historical texts for them to be his claims. So we're tricked by this language all the time.
All right. 15 seconds. Okay. Max feels provoked.
I do feel deeply provoked, especially by the high five. Provoked and affronted. Don't worry, there's a deal where I get 100 Rand every time they agree, so I'm a millionaire already. Okay. I will just say very, very quickly, on that, the claims that Jesus makes in the Bible, and I've made this point a little bit already, is that the Bible is not actually one book. It's 66 books written by 40 people across 1,500 years across 3 continents. And its legitimacy, I don't have the time, I only have 15 seconds and I'm already at 22, but its legitimacy, I would submit to you, can be, if we're willing to take the time to go through it, can be verified from the peer review that occurs within itself and the cross-references within those 66 books, and also a number of extra-biblical and extrinsic evidence outside of that.
Thank you. Jacques, do you believe in marriage as an atheist? If yes, why?
I believe that questions need to speak about things which involve the same kind of realm of logic. I don't see how atheism and religion are at all related to each other. I mean, is the questioner claiming that marriage is a religious invention? And people have bonded in pre-Christian societies before. They didn't call it marriage. Marriage is a legal instrument, which is a pair bonding formalization. You, again, don't get to double count that as evidence of religion being true. It's just the legal category. So yes, I do believe in it.
All right. With 30 seconds to spare. Responses? Any? All right.
To rework a tweet,
yeah.
Is marriage still a thing?
All right, we'll come back to you, Max.
Sure.
Max, as a rape victim, I would like to know if you think God knew about it and had planned for it to happen, since he apparently knows how our lives would be before we are even born.
Can I just start by saying that there is no way that I'm going to even purport to try and honour or fully respect the absolute atrocity that you've been through and the tragedy that you've been through with a 45-second response up here. And so I completely get that from the beginning. My view as a follower of Jesus is that God has never, would never, will never, if the character of God is as we take it as Christians from the Bible as the God that he claims to be, would never will anyone to rape, would never will rape. It would never be acceptable. Whether he knew that it was going to happen, the extent to which that was, a free action of the person that did that to you, I'm not God. I don't know the response to that. There are different Christians that have different views on God's foreknowledge, on this whole question of predestination, this very clunky theological term, predestination. But with an issue as sensitive as that, look, I'd be happy to talk to you or to have someone else from our team speak with you afterwards. But I'm not going to go anywhere near trying to justify or explain from a Christian perspective what you had. The Bible is so vehemently and viciously against that, against rape, and I fully just want to respect what you've been through and just acknowledge it as a tragedy and an atrocity. So I'm really sorry for that.
Yeah.
No, Max, that's not good enough. Hold on. It's very simple. Either God is all-knowing or God is not all-knowing. If A, then God knew I was going to be raped. If B, then you've got to drop one of the attributes that the Christians normally ascribe to God. Which is it? Pick one.
I'm not going to answer that in the context of rape. I'm happy to answer the question in the abstract, in a philosophical sense. And my view to that would be, because this is this same old Epicurean thing, if he's all-loving and all-knowing and all-powerful, then there shouldn't be any kind of suffering, rape or otherwise. The only way that washes with the Christian God, as I know him, as the Bible presents him, is if an all-powerful God chooses to limit his power. He limits the use of his power at particular times and in certain situations. So that's the only way logically that I think it can fit, that he allows things to happen in a broken world that otherwise he might not will to happen, desire to happen, want to happen, like happening. The reasons for which he does that, or the extent to which he does that, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not God, and so I can't speak for him on something that important and that big. But I can chart a logical way through the issue, but not when it's so emotionally and emotively cloaked in something that's so tragic for people, for individuals. We've all been through certain things, but something like that is just so far beyond my comprehension even, that I don't want to disrespect that.
This is such an important issue. Please don't think our short treatment of it with regards to time. I'm conflicted as a moderator because I've got more questions here, but I do want to say, out of all these questions so far, and probably the ones that are to come, this is probably one of the most important ones. And I think all of us here have already said it. And so please, again, don't think we're trivializing the issue as we move on. This is really, really important. Eusebius McKaiser, it's got your surname as well. God is an almighty being. Such trivial, in inverted commas, issues on earth are accounted for in the ever after. So, the doubt in God based on human suffering in the present is blind rage. Can one say that a believer is able to separate themselves from that emotion?
Have we, I don't know why you guys are clapping. Just hold 1 second. Have we been taught nothing by the fallists? And I hope some of them are here tonight. Just because you are filled with rage and passion doesn't mean that your brain switches off. You can be passionate about an all-knowing God not stopping a rape that happened, and you can still engage critically on these questions. So, to answer the question more head-on, effectively what you are doing is reasoning in a very circular manner that one should be satisfied with the answer because the proof, which you do not have, will come in the afterlife. No, either the proof is decisive or in probabilistic reasoning very strong, or it is not. And to sort of hedge your bets on what might happen the day you are no longer alive in your biological person is to make a non-argument based on evidence that you have not seen or experienced or know of. So whichever way you cut it logically, combined with a bit of passion, the argument just doesn't wash.
Jacques, I'm going to prioritize if you want to respond. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, just very quickly. And this just gives me a chance to give a very small continuation of the response I gave earlier and address something Eusebius said about the response not coming in this life. The response to atrocities like that and tragedies like that do come in this life, in the Christian frame. Because this God is not just a God who promises eternal life with him when we come into a relationship, but he promises hope and strength and comfort through tragedies like this, in the midst of tragedies like this. And I think that's really important, because there's a uniqueness there in the Christian worldview, that this God takes our hand through the suffering, amidst the suffering. God understands the Christian God. He came and suffered for us and with us. So even something as terrible as this, he's there for you if you're willing to take his hand that he's reaching out to you.
Eusebius, I think since it addresses something you said as well earlier, you're allowed to respond.
Yeah, Max, there's nothing redeemable about the evil of rape, including the mystery of something that may inadvertently come out of it that makes you see the world in a different kind of way because of the pain that you wish you hadn't gone through, but now that you've gone through it, you've come out on the other side and you're a stronger survivor. Whichever way you cut it, it's very simple. And this is why I wanted a chance, and thank you to the moderator for allowing me to do so now, to respond to your initial defense around the problem of moral evil in the world. And you said that basically part of what constitutes a loving God is that he gives us a certain kind of freedom. Now, I'm happy to run with the freedom and depart from Jacques on a deterministic view of our behavior. And I agree with you that we're given freedom. But you didn't respond, I noticed back then, to my analogy that wasn't meant to just be for rhetorical purposes. My freedom can be exercised over a limited set of choices. The would-be rapist can still be given lovingly freedom, but what we can exclude from the set of options is rape, and make him choose between going to the movie and masturbating. He still has free will, so God still shows love by endowing that would-be rapist with free will, but takes away, because God is all-loving and all-powerful, the evil option. So again, what that shows is that it's not good enough to say, I'm going to choose humbly a mystery about how God operates, because the problem of evil is a logical problem rather than a problem of a lack of knowledge that has to be filled if I were to talk to God directly.
All right. Again, another important issue. But I do have to get Jacques into the conversation. Jacques, what is the most productive way to engage people on their beliefs?
I think for me a key part of productive engagement is to apply what is called Rappaport's rules, and this comes from, you can read about it in Daniel Dennett's last book, Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking. And he asks us to start every conversation, every disagreement, with trying to imagine the strongest possible version of your interlocutor's point of view. And you try to phrase it or frame it in such a way that the person you're debating with or talking to might even be inclined to say, thank you, I wish I'd thought of putting it that way. Sure. And then you list any points of agreement that you have with them. And only after you've done that, once you form that kind of bond of trust with them, do you start disagreeing and start telling them where they could perhaps improve their argument. The point is that our conversations now, and I think it's partly the fault of social media and so forth, our conversations now are adversarial from the start. It's point scoring, it's a way to show that I'm right and you're wrong, and both sides stop thinking about what they're doing. All they're doing is defending their camp, and we become more and more polarized. Most of the time, the truth is out there in the middle somewhere rather than on the extremes. Most of the time, not all the time. And that's what we should aim to do.
Thank you. All right. I think I saw both of you nod, so I'm not going to ask for your response. We have an agreement tonight.
We do.
Last set of questions, and then I'm going to ask for your closing statements. Max, I think it's going to give you an opportunity to pick up where Eusebius left off. If God does exist and is able to eliminate suffering, why doesn't he? Why would he prefer to suffer with people, like you said, rather than just get rid of suffering?
Sure. I'll give you the answer that I deeply and honestly believe to be the case, and I find it compelling in my mind and in my heart, and is the answer that the Bible provides. And I completely respect and understand if there are people here whom this answer just doesn't resonate with because of what you might have been through or what you're going through now. The answer to the question, if the Christian God is for real and what I believe is true, as I believe it to be, is that God has gotten rid of suffering. He has defeated it. He has conquered it. He did so when he came into the world as a person. And he went to the cross. He allowed himself to be crucified, again, limiting himself, limiting his power, when he had the power not to do that. Bringing together love and justice and mercy in one moment in verifiable, historical, human history. And literally took all of the pain, all of the suffering, all of the immorality, all of the imperfection of humankind from the past, then, and into the future, and dealt with it and acquitted the aspects of his character of himself as a God of perfect justice, and acquitted the aspect of the character of himself as a God of perfect love, and the aspect of his character as a God of perfect mercy. Bringing all of those three things together, that's why, towards the end of the Bible, God is very, very clear that because of what Jesus did on that cross, there will be a time where there will be no more suffering, that he will wipe away every tear. As Samwise Gamgee paraphrased it in Lord of the Rings, there'll be a time where effectively the suffering and the atrocities that we've all seen and been through will come untrue. Will come untrue. That's the promise of eternity that we have through the cross of Jesus Christ.
Thank you. Eusebius, you've called yourself an intellectual and moral being. Where do your moral standards come from? If the Christian God does not exist, who are we to say what is right and what is wrong?
Jacques started sketching what that answer would look like. When I was a master's student, I was sharing this with Max earlier, I defended moral reasons for actions without those moral reasons making any reference to theology. And I'm not a relativist or a subjectivist. I don't think anything goes, and that when it comes to moral debates about everything from polygamy to sex work, homosexuality, that we cannot make progress and that we cannot evaluate some arguments in moral reasoning as being stronger than others. Again, sociologically, most of us are raised in this country to believe that you can't do moral reasoning outside of a Christian ethics framework, which is rubbish. It's obvious that rape is wrong, and I do not need to be a believer in God or of the Islamic faith to be able to account for what it is that is so wrong about the violence and the violation of one's bodily, psychological, and integrity and reproductive rights when it comes to the violence, for example, in rape. So when we go through a bunch of things that you and I agree are wrong, it will be very easy for me, in consensus with you, to account for the wrong in those actions without resorting to any reference to the Bible. And here's the kicker, and I'll leave it here. The funny thing is, most of you who self-identify as Christian, if I had to ask you what's wrong with cheating, what's wrong with kicking an animal, what's wrong with burning a baby, you probably can answer that question yourselves without reference to God.
Okay. Okay, 30 seconds, please.
Just very quickly, just to address and just to clarify the frame of what Eusebius was saying, because obviously I agree with everything you said in a moral context, but not so much in a methodological context. I don't think anyone is saying for a second that it's not obvious that rape is wrong. No one's saying for a second that you need Christianity or you need to know the Christian God to be good or to be ethical or to live moral lives or to understand what's right and wrong. What the critique is, and the question for the agnostic and the atheist to answer, is that there is no rational basis again on which to determine what is right and wrong without an objective reference point against which to deem what is good and evil.
I'll allow response.
Yeah.
I know you disagree, but sure.
No, obviously I disagree, and again, I'm not sure why. No, seriously, I mean, guys, folks, sometimes we just need to think plainly and take it out of even the academic context and some of the language which we've used here. As human beings, we have interests. There are certain kinds of things from a psychological, empirical view that all of us do not like, that is just in the contingent makeup of a human being. We, for the most part, other than maybe late at night through consensual behavior, do not like pain, for example. We don't like suffering outside of very limited context. And so it makes sense that in a community of moral beings, as social creatures, we will therefore consent to certain kind of moral rules, principles, and values that guide our behavior as a moral community without reference to God. And the objectivity is anchored in empirical psychology and just contingent truth about human beings.
Yes.
There's no mystery.
Jacques, just because love, the mind, beauty cannot be empirically quantified, do we then as humans say these above entities do not exist?
So we'd start, I think, by rejecting the premise there. I mean, they're not empirically quantifiable right now, but there's no reason to believe that they're always not going to be empirically quantifiable. And there'll be certain differences in your brain chemistry for all of those states. Certain levels of certain hormones and chemicals and neurons firing in certain patterns and all that sort of thing. Now, of course, it would be highly unromantic to hook your partner up to a brain scanner or an fMRI machine when they tell you that they love you, right? So we develop these shorthands, such as, are they currently hitting me with a frying pan or not? And all of those sorts of things to intuit whether what they're saying is in fact true or not. But that is our human level romantic way of doing these things. So just because you come out of a movie and say, I enjoyed that, it was really funny, your friends don't say, can you prove that it was funny? We develop this kind of more casual language about these things, but that doesn't mean that they aren't empirically quantifiable. They are empirically quantifiable, but we suck the fun out of them when we make them so.
Do you want to respond to that, Eusebius? Do you want to respond?
Yes, please.
30 seconds, please.
Just very quickly, because this gets back to something else before that I didn't respond to, I didn't have a chance to. And it's just on empirical quantifiability in and of itself. So I think there's a risk we can fall into in thinking that just when something comes within the purview of science and science can explain it, that's another thing that goes towards the disproving of God. And so I just want to clarify very clearly that science, by its very definition, is the investigation and understanding of the physical and natural world. God, if he exists primarily in the metaphysical world. So science, by definition, is not interested, nor is it qualified to make pronouncements on the existence or non-existence of God.
Do you want to respond? Okay, then I'm going to move to closing statement, but you can. I'm saying, do you want to respond?
Very quickly. I really thought that WITS gives you the edge, but apparently not. Because what you should all recognize logically is that what Max has just done is to smuggle in a massive claim about the existence of a realm beyond the one in which you and I are now sitting without evidence.
All right.
I talked about the evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've almost been, for most of you, 2 hours in this venue. And we've come to that time where I'm going to now ask for your closing statements to wrap us up, just some parting shots for the evening. I know that we want to hear some more, but that's the point. So the first shall be last, the last shall be first. Jacques, let me start with you.
All right.
For 2 minutes, please.
Thanks. Well, I think I want to start by first thanking you all. It's a lovely amount of people, a number of people who are here. And your enthusiasm is boundless. In fact, it's so boundless I sometimes have been struggling to figure out what side you're on, because sometimes the cheers are loudest for Max and sometimes for Eusebius. So yeah, you're very confusing to me. and then I want to thank my panelists and our moderator. I think we've had, for the most part, a very fruitful and polite and respectful, mutually respectful conversation. I think that's a tribute to my fellow panelists up here. The thought I'd want to close on is really just to remind you, when you talk about these sorts of things, to engage with that fundamental challenge I offered you, the thought experiment of trying to hear these words fresh for the first time. When somebody makes some sort of metaphysical claim to you about the nature of God or about your obligations to God, all of these sorts of claims, you should try to hear them without centuries of religious training. Right? As if they were new, and how do they strike you in terms of what else you know about the world? You know various things about engineering and how cars get over bridges and how you fly in your plane and don't crash usually, etc., etc. That world is fully explicable. You treat it in a perfectly logical sort of way, and then suddenly we wave our hands and transport ourselves to a mystery realm, right? And that is given special license and special favors epistemically, special reservation from criticism, for no good reason apart from its historicity. Okay? So going back to the moral stuff, there's a lovely chapter in Simon Blackburn's beautiful introduction to philosophy called Think, where he talks about God. And he says, imagine that you're in a residence or a dormitory or a hotel, and there are rats everywhere, and the roof is leaking, and the carpets are rotting, and whatever. And the residents all swear to you, yes, there is a landlord, and he cares for us deeply. And you go knock on his door day after day, and he never answers the door. But people keep saying, he is there, just trust and obey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eusebius.
Firstly, I want to thank my fellow panelists, and can I also ask, in particular, that on behalf of the panel, the interlocutors, and yourselves, can we also thank our moderator, please, who's been excellent. And certainly, I want to echo from Jacques, from my side, I'm deeply appreciative. I'm extremely hyper aware with the work that I do, that we're never entitled to readers, viewers, listeners, audience members, and even if you have a personal interest in this topic, you've come here this evening. I want to thank you so much for coming. So thank you for that. I want to use my closing minutes to preach. First to the atheists and agnostics, and then to the Christians in the room. To us as atheists and agnostics, to not be a Richard Dawkins atheist. There's a lot to be learned from being a Jacques Rousseau atheist, where you take your interlocutor, including your Christian peers, very seriously, and you think about the role that religion plays. One of my good friends is in the audience here, Bandile. We were talking, for example, around the interesting sociological role of religion in society for black people. That you might be philosophically committed, for example, to atheism, but still appreciate the role of liberation theology, even in this country, when you think of figures like Reverend Ellen Bussack and the role that the church plays in helping to fight evil. You're going to miss beautiful parts of life if you are dogmatic about your atheism or even your agnosticism. So you need to snap out of it. It doesn't make you a better intellectual if you are dogmatic in your atheism and in your theism. And then my final sort of preaching message for Christians is that, and it's deeply personal for me, my favorite Christians and Christian friends, Max is a new one. I'm sitting next to one here, Mshlatse. I can see Father Matt Charlesworth in the audience. My favorite Christian friends are the ones who are deeply committed to living a critical life and a critical relationship with their faith. So all of us were raised, most of us were raised in Christian households. We weren't necessarily raised to think critically about our faith, and you shouldn't be scared to be in critical dialogue with yourself and with atheists. Thank you.
Max, your 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Yeah, look, it's been such a privilege to be here. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share the stage with these guys whom I now consider friends. I'm so pleased and encouraged that this country has got public intellectuals like you guys that are helping to inspire and to chart its future. So it's been a real honour. So thank you for sharing your time and your stage and your beautiful country with me and some of our team over this last week. I actually agree with a lot of what was said in the closing statements from the other side of the panel. Yes, I totally agree. My encouragement and my urge to all of you is not to come to this question with presuppositions, but come to it with open hearts and open minds to look at the evidence. And as Plato said, follow the evidence to where it leads. My personal view and the view of so many others that I know well, that I trust, that I have good evidence are not crazy or deluded or stupid, is that if you do that, if you follow that evidence to where it leads with a genuinely open heart and open mind, free of prejudice, free of presupposition, then it will lead you to the person of Jesus Christ. Now, evidence, we've talked a lot about evidence, propositional truth claims, their verifiability, and that will get you so far on any of our views of the world. But in the end, the Christian worldview is not a propositionally grounded worldview. It is relationally grounded. It is about a one-on-one relationship with an individual. And so I encourage you all, wherever you are, whatever your current view is to investigate, look closely at the person of Jesus. Look closely at his biographical accounts, the accounts of his life, and look at the credibility of those accounts. By all means, test them, attack them, scrutinize them, break them down to first principles, build them up, break them down again, and look through again. And test the evidence around them, test the credibility of the Bible, and see how it fits. Because if it's true, it can stand up to questioning. It can stand up to your scrutiny. And my strong view is that it will win through in the end. My plea to you is that you would all do that, and that, if you look for God with all of your heart, then you will find him. That's what he promises in the Bible. But I close by thanking you all. I thank McKaiser, I thank Jacques and Eusebius. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thank you all for being here as well.
We are grateful, obviously, to the university. This is a great venue. I think tonight was a good use of the land. Thank you to the many societies that have come together to make this week tonight possible. Thank you to you as the audience. The question tonight was, does the Christian God exist? I hope that you've got lots to think about, regardless of what position you came here with. But I also certainly hope that you have lots to think about, and at least we also agree that these amazing speakers have made a great case for a kind of conversation that thoroughly belongs as part of the fabric of this space, the university. Would you please, for the last time tonight, as we say goodnight, just join me again in showing your appreciation for our speakers. Thank you, and good night.